Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do good now. Walk justly now. No one is expected to finish the work, but neither may anyone desist from it. Rabbi Tarfon, Ethics of the Fathers. The Daily Grind, Chapter 146. Hey, Elle. Momo answered her phone without looking at it. Long time no see. You know, since you just fucking left in the middle of the night without telling anybody. How did you know it was me? Elle asked, sounding legitimately shaken. How do people keep doing that? Oh, I have a totem that lets me sense inbound phone calls. I've been figuring out how to dial it down to a really small radius so it's basically just a perfectly useful caller ID. It also gives me an address if it's from a business so I can order surgical strikes against phone scammers. Momo sounded weirdly distracted for somebody talking about solving one of the three great problems facing modern civilization. So, you want to come back or what? Nice try with the shame, but I've built up a tolerance to it from talking to my mom all week, Elle replied, a very wry sort of cheer to her words. Uh-huh. Momo sounded like she was focusing on something else aside from the phone call. Elle blinked to herself and took a deep breath before she continued. No, I don't want to come back. Yet. Maybe I won't ever, I don't know, but I've got something else I want to talk about. The reply came through distant, like Momo had set her phone down. Uh-huh, she said again. Are you ignoring me out of spite? Elle felt that all too quick flare of anger in her chest, the kind that kept her getting her into trouble. Come on, I'm trying to be nice. I had to borrow my mom's phone to call you. What? Oh, no, I'm just working on a thing, Momo said. Computer stuff, whatever. All right, I'm smart enough to admit that you might have been the wrong person to call, Elle grudgingly spoke, more to herself than anybody else. Yeah, you're right. Hang on, I'll get James, Momo said. Wait, no! Elle started to protest, but there was already a slight clattering as the phone was tossed onto a desk, and a couple seconds later the sound of a heavy door opening and Momo shouting something down a hallway. No, I don't want to talk to James, she muttered to herself. Ooh, James, Elle's mom said as she passed by the living room couch that Elle was splayed out on. The condition of borrowing the phone had been using it in the living room, and Elle still hadn't built up enough shame tolerance to make this okay. Who's that, honey? A boyfriend of yours? Did you travel so far just to see him and he broke your heart? Just say the word and I'll fight him for you. Mom, please don't. Partly because you're just super wrong, but also because he'd probably let you win and it would be really embarrassing. Elle sighed. Momo, are you there? She said into the cell phone. Please? Momo was not within standard human hearing range of this device at the moment, a distant voice answered Elle. It sounded simultaneously lightly synthesized, like the words were all being spoken individually, and also quite a lot like a kid. A young girl, probably, on the edge of being a teenager, maybe. But the language, it didn't come across as how a kid spoke. Not at all. Sorry, who's this? Elle asked. I do not have a name yet. Who are you? Are you here? Are you this device? What senses do you possess? What information do you possess? There was a sudden end to the questions. Elle slowly moved the phone away from her head and stared at it with a wide-eyed, concerned frown. If you make that face forever, it'll stick that way, her mother said, passing by again. Elle growled at her and put the phone back to her ear. Okay. In what I think is the right order of answers, I'm Elle, no, most of them, I guess, and I mostly spend my time thinking about the chain of mistakes that brought me to this point in my life. You are human! The voice sounded distantly happy to have made that conclusion. Is that correct? And you aren't, Elle deduced. Well, that sure is something. And then, either mercifully or the opposite, James's own voice cut in. Hey, currently nameless. Hey, Elle. He said the last bit much clearer, killing the speakerphone and picking up the receiver on his end. What's up? Are you going to try to weaponize guilt against me too? She asked, a bit bitter. Nah, I'm busy, James replied, sounding like he was eating something. Besides, I've met you. You can do it fine without my help. Elle winced. Ow, dude, she said. My bad. I'm not actually trying to be mean. So what's up? I... Elle didn't know how to phrase this. Formal or casual? Pleading or transactional? And then she realized that of anyone in the world, the one person who would least like her to play social games would be James. So, she just went with being honest. I think there's something weird going on in my hometown, and I want to ask for help. If, Okay, got an address? Elle faltered. Just like... Yeah, no, of course. You didn't even let me finish. Yeah, I don't need to sleep anyway. I can add another project to the pile. Plus, I can teleport. Okay. Elle paused. About that. I was... I wanted to ask if any of you, like, the you guys that I met and kinda like, not just random members of your guild, if you wanted to visit the road dungeon with me. Absolutely, James answered. Oh, you mean like bring cars along? I mean, we could just teleport there and buy cars, but Karen's on me about budget stuff. There was a hum from his end, like he was buying time to think. Or, or I could take a vacation road trip, James muttered, mostly to himself. Can I bring a mesh along? He asked Elle. Sure, he seems smart, she acquiesced. Sarah or Alana, even Momo too, I guess. I don't really know anyone else there. Maybe one or two of whoever you think matters? We can't find Alana, James said, sudden pain in his voice. He shook it off pretty quickly, though. We're looking, though. Maybe we'll randomly stumble across her on a road trip. Who knows? Also, can I name your dungeon? Too late, Elle gave a victorious grin. I already have. Damn. James snapped his fingers loudly enough that Elle could hear it through the phone. Ah, well. But yes, we can be out there in a week or so. Just gotta make sure everything here is working and stable. Yeah? That work for you? Yeah, no rush, Elle said, lying. She felt like there was a lot of pressure, because she wasn't sure if everything was falling apart, or if she'd just changed so much she didn't recognize home anymore. Oh, also, do you know how someone would identify anyone who has magic? She asked. You can do that, can't you? James asked her. You've got a spell for it. I don't think any of us do, so you're the expert. Oh my fucking god. Elle set the phone down, covered her face with one of the couch cushions, and screamed into it. She picked the phone back up. Forgot or something, James was saying. That'd be hilarious, and... Elle put the phone down again. She hung up on James, set her mom's phone on the tile counters surrounding the kitchen, considered screaming into the couch again, but instead called her mom to tell her that she was going out for a few hours. Elle still had a few bucks to her name, and there were a few preparations she had to make if she was ever planning to hit the road again. I am starting to worry that this is getting almost routine, James said, cursing everything about the night's delve. Rick looked around worriedly, the new guy seeming confused as the other four people in their harvest team groaned in exasperation. Okay, the tough old laborer and ex-idealist said. This is my first time in here. I get that you kids already have a schedule set up, but there was a whole debate going on as to whether this place uses story logic, so isn't it kind of stupid to say, that? He pointed a meaty, scarred finger at James. It's an ongoing problem, Sarah admitted. There were 5 of them, moving through head-high cubicle walls. They'd learned mostly by accident that the walls here were made of a sort of soft, crumbling stone on the inside of their thin, carpeted exteriors, which made it all too easy to be ambushed by things lurking just inside the small rooms all around them. Still, they pressed on. Minor skirmishes with shalaxies and potted plants made it just tense enough that no one could really relax, despite James's occasional bits of banter. The near-constant wave of small traps was almost predictable at this point, but that didn't make it any less scary. Almost was not certain. They pulled 2 carts along with them, the first heavy canvas camping tool filled with a spare medkit, a few extra pieces of gear they might need, a few dozen small yellow orbs they'd collected, and one friendly Shalaxi that had climbed into the cart when they weren't looking and then made Windows startup dings at them when they tried to move it. Sarah had named it Dark Chocolate Mocha, and it was eating the orbs when it thought no one was looking. The second cart was carrying a plastic bin full of bags full of magical ritual coffee, and about 200 pounds of refined silver. It was the one no one wanted to be in charge of hauling, and it was the one James had ended up in charge of hauling, the braced cloth base sagging under the weight of their loot from the first water cooler cave they'd visited. It wasn't all that they would be stacking into the cart. They were on their way to another cave that had been scouted last week, hoping to add to their pile of raw resources that would allow the Order to continue its growth, to hire more people, to do more good, to make a bigger impact. Maybe they could buy a tank. James had gotten an orb for +1 skill rank, drive, tank, panther, and now all he wanted to do was try it out. Not that he hadn't always wanted to drive a tank anyway, but now it was far less theoretical. It wasn't even a military fantasy. It was just that it seemed like it would be a unique experience. They had more people in here tonight, to the point that they were now starting to run up against the limit of how many people they could funnel through the door before the time dilation and 8-hour limit became an issue. Experienced and new delvers alike, here to explore, learn, and exploit the hell out of this weird space. A lot of people were acting as just straight-up scouts today, too, looking for new biomes within their safe travel range of a few miles, searching for sources of wealth and prosperity. Wealth, material resources, new tools for creation of happiness, life to befriend, anything that would bring the Order closer to stability, closer to accomplishing more good, closer to a utopia. James joked about it being routine, but a routine that built a better world was a pretty good routine, to him anyway. And soon that routine was going to get shaken up. He didn't know what to think about it. A new dungeon, a new frontier, new potential tools, new potential lethal mistakes. James felt more than a little apprehensive about Elle's request. He understood the office. He felt safe here, despite its danger. There? Anything could happen there. He'd arranged a meeting with everyone in a couple of days to set up his upcoming absence. He was gonna go, but for some reason he was more nervous than excited. At least here, he knew what the lethal mistakes were, and how to mostly avoid them. "Hush," he hissed out, holding up a hand and stopping the procession. There, on the edge of his enhanced awareness, there was a rattling noise, and a hiss more menacing than his own. "Tumblefeed, ahead and to the left," he spoke in a low tone to the group. "Could be an open space. Rick, with me. Alex, firebomb. Let's check it out." He felt his blood start to sing and his heart pumped, a small grin making its way to his lips. Yeah, maybe he was nervous. And yes, maybe the future was uncertain. But in moments like this, there was something angry and dangerous between their group and a new sliver of something magical. And that was a very special feeling to James indeed. "Momo," Anesh called into the basement. He'd only just stepped off the elevator. He was almost positive he was in the wrong one, and all the lights were off, all the hallways empty. It was, more than the dungeons even, a little spooky. The dungeons were a lot of things, but subtle was not one of them. Officium Mundi and the Akashic Sewer didn't seem capable of going more than half an hour without a monster attack, even if one of those two places showed radically more restraint than the other. Clutter Ascent, too, didn't really hesitate to let things get weird. There was no question, as you stood at the top of that attic's little staircase, that you had just stepped into a place of magic and wonder. After all, there were 3 different skylights showing 3 different skies, all within eyesight. The basement, though. The basement wasn't actually that weird. It didn't have monsters, probably. It didn't have traps that weren't just OSHA violations. It didn't have any unnatural effects that they hadn't put there mostly on purpose. It was just creepy. Basements were creepy. Anesh felt less like he was admitting that to himself and more like he was mentally throwing up his arms and proclaiming it. He refused to back down at this point. He would stroll into an obvious paper pusher ambush with more enthusiasm than he'd walk through an unlit concrete basement hallway, though. Momo, are you down here? His voice squeaked a little bit. I'm not sticking around if this is an early Halloween thing. No reply. In the distance, down the hall to his left, Anesh could hear some kind of noise. Music, maybe? He strained his ears, and was so distracted he nearly jumped out of his skin when a voice next to his elbow let out a long, sinuous hiss to go with the word, "Hello." Anesh made a noise somewhere between a screech and a howl, tripped over his own feet as he tried to spin around, and toppled onto his ass on the hard ground with a painful thump. He found himself face to snout with a Camerconda, one of the ones that was wearing one of those motorized arm sets, long metal limbs splayed out from its back in an almost menacing way. A green blinking light on its camera eye appraised him carefully before the snake creature pulled back and tipped its head up. Sorry, sorry, it said, its digital voice modulated to draw the words out a little more than normal, in addition to having a slight feminine tint to it. This way. Follow. Follow. It offered a pair of limbs to help Anesh up, but he pulled his ass off the floor using the wall instead. Not out of spite, just that he'd calmed down a little bit, and the rational part of his brain knew that those arm sets couldn't move nearly as much weight as a human could. Not yet, anyway. He followed the Camerconda down the unlit hall, amusement replacing the heart-wrenching terror he had felt only seconds ago, as the snake gingerly extracted a pair of heavy flashlights and clicked them on with awkward motions of its new fingers. It turned out, giving a species that had lived its whole life without arms a sudden influx of limbs did not make them proficient overnight. Sorry for no lights, the Camerconda said to him as they walked, hissing slightly. Construction occurring. Small light, she offered Anesh one of the flashlights. Why didn't you have these on when you came to get me, instead of just creeping out of the blackness like some kind of shadow creature? Anesh asked, channeling a bit of his boyfriend into his words. Can see in the dark, the Camerconda replied without hesitation. Anesh gave the snake an exasperated sigh and followed the rest of the way in companionable quiet. It didn't take long to get where Momo had set up shop, or rather been assigned to set up shop. People were getting tired of her totem experiments causing headaches, even if she had found other pursuits lately. She also wasn't the only one down here. Anesh, you're here, James called over. Great, come look at this. Anesh walked in, the Camerconda trailing off to join a group of Order aspirants who were going through a box of dungeon tech no one had found a use for yet. Momo and James were standing in the middle of the warehouse space, James with a hand on his hip as he looked over something on a clipboard, and Momo popping her joints with her arms stretched wide over her head, leaning back and staring up at the thing that James had started them all working on. All right, Anesh started. I have so very many problems here. Okay, I understand, but first, touch this. James held up the clipboard, a circle drawn on one side in Sharpie. Anesh poked it. No, like hold your finger there, you dork. James rolled his eyes. Anesh did so, and then jumped as James ran his fingers across Anesh's own. No, that wasn't right. It was across the other side of the clipboard, but it felt very real. What is this? He asked. Magic clipboard. Cool, very cool, but I don't see how it helps us. Also, you're sidetracking me. Magic Sharpie, actually, James grinned. Circles drawn on opposite sides of material seem to conduct tactile sensation, but like as one big nerve ending. So I've been taking John Green's artistic advice and drawing lots of small circles and weird patterns. I'm trying to make something cool work. James looked, Anesh realized, strangely content. It's a good day, James said, nodding at his boyfriend. James, a chunk of the parking lot is missing. Anesh looked at their project, squeezed his eyes shut, and opened them again. Yep, it was still there. James, you stole a chunk of the parking lot. James didn't even have the good grace to look sheepish. Is the parking lot really that important? He asked, rhetorically. You teleport to work, you wanker, Anesh bit back. Momo, help me out. No, you aren't going to care. Wait, does anyone in this room drive to this building? Anesh called out. One person who lived in the building, 2 people who teleported everywhere, 4 Camercondas, who also lived in the building, and 3 high schoolers who got rides from their parents or took the bus, and 1 man who flew a dragon everywhere, and 1 environmentally conscious engineer who biked everywhere instead of driving, all looked at Anesh with silent expressions before turning back to what they were doing before he had interrupted them. "We can replace the asphalt," James said. "Now, check this out." He turned and swept his arm out, gazing up at their creation. "I've been unable to avoid checking it out this entire time," Anesh said. "James, I love you, but why?" Joke answer? Because I'm tired of Dave having the only mech. James couldn't hold back a wild, cheerful grin. He really was having a great day. Also, here's a weird thing I'm learning. Those startlingly specific architecture skill orbs actually do have broader practical uses. It's just that they don't have them by default. It takes a lot of effort to, pick out small answers to big questions. Anesh gave up on complaining, or being contrary, or trying to argue. He just walked up next to James, thumped his head down on his boyfriend's shoulder, and gave a single chuckle. If nothing else, he was just happy to see James smiling. "All right," he said. "What's going on?" In front of them, dominating the warehouse space, was what had started the day as a pile of plundered asphalt. Over the last 20 hours or so, working with input from what felt like half the order in some way, James and Momo had taken chunks of asphalt stolen from the parking lot above, as well as from a few construction sites around the city's road network, and abused the hell out of the blue orb from the telepads. When absorbed, it gave the same thing every time. Plus 14 activations. Manipulate asphalt. Blue orbs, it turned out, did not exactly have diminishing returns when absorbed. If you had already burned up the original power, you would get the exact same power, again, at the same strength, and in the same quantity. Beginning with a rough outline and a broad end goal, and slowly incorporating more outside help and actual planning as they went along, the growing team had turned disparate chunks of rough black material into a vaguely humanoid shape. Currently it stood 25 feet tall, didn't look remotely human in its proportions. It had legs that were far too thick and short compared to arms that were far too long and almost perfectly smooth. No need for muscle definition when you weren't planning to actually use muscles. "We built a mech," James answered Anesh. "Yes, I can see that. I get that. But James, why? Also how, but mostly why?" James laughed. "Well, I gave you the joke answer. The real answer is carry capacity, because I am pretty sure that if we do this right, we can use this with a telepad to move heavy cargo. Fast." "And the how, which I am becoming increasingly curious about?" Anesh asked. James explained. Their first thought had just been to make it human-shaped enough and try from there, but that instantly presented problems. Actually using the blue orbs took a lot of focus, which conflicted with the needed level of disassociation to actually see their growing colossus as a body, so they had started poking around the stockpile of magic items and the effects they had on offer. The first few were a little easy. The pen that conducted tactile sensation, a coat that regulated body temperature, a few vision options, with the one that they settled on being a pair of glasses that gave you a sense of everything moving above a certain speed within a radius around you. Then they'd started to get questions about what they were working on, and from there, more help. A blue orb from someone with a handful of charges left that shifted an object to being frictionless. They'd use that to reshape the joints of their creation into perfectly, literally perfectly, smooth spheres. And from there, using manipulate asphalt to control the limbs became infinitely easier. A pair of hiking boots someone had found in the office that couldn't fall over had been shaped into the base of the feet of the mech. The legs would snap in half before it lost balance now. To prevent that snapping, a reinforced rebar frame, with tungsten rods summoned from someone's orange orb job, making up the finer bones of the massive fingers and limbs. Pencils and pens were fused into the structure too, inactive so long as the thing wasn't a body, but after it was, one that changed color, one that projected writing, one that always landed upright when thrown, one that self-sharpened. Mundane technologies too. The interior of the creation was hollow. It had no head, just a smooth body with 2 slots inside meant to hold humans. Oxygen tanks, reserve stockpiles of telepad blue orbs, telepads, rations, medical supplies, antennas reaching through the skin of the neck to stay in contact with the drone swarm that could provide vision of the outside. They'd already partially tested it, too. The LSD trick mostly worked. Someone could, with enough effort, mistake this thing for their own body. Some purple orbs would shift to it also, not at a perfect 1-to-1 ratio to what they did to a human body, and not all of them. It wasn't a human shell, after all, but enough of them would line up. The problem was, that person could barely do anything with it before losing the connection that they had to it. They had solved that with someone who had picked up 4 ranks in hypnotism from a large yellow orb. Putting a pilot into a trance where all they had to focus on was using blues to move their new body, and let someone else take the finer, more fluid control. It hadn't been enough to be functional, though, so James, who had watched Pacific Rim 8,000 times, suggested this solution. A second pilot, Skulljack plugged into the first. Not a gestalt mind, just close enough to give mental nudges on what to do. One mind making tactical choices, one mind executing them without distraction. They hadn't tested that part yet. In fact, they had just finished securing a connecting Skulljack cable to an automatic cable winder embedded inside the heart of their creation when Anesh had arrived. Well, they'd been doing that and also the extra oxygen tank, just in case. Safety first. And then you showed up, James finished breathlessly explaining to Anesh. Actually, do you want to test this with me? We're probably drift compatible, right? You're not putting some kind of dungeon tech weapons platform in it? Anesh asked for the 4th or 5th time. James shrugged. I mean, why? We're not taking it into a dungeon. We don't plan to actually fight anybody with it. Even if we did, this thing probably won't stand up to like a basic anti-material rifle. It's literally just there to cheese around the telepath restrictions. So, you destroyed our parking lot, dragged 20 people away from what they were working on. They were excited. You haven't slept or eaten a real meal for far too long. You probably dumped a not insignificant chunk of our limited budget into, and correct me if I'm wrong here, an over-engineered forklift. There was a long pause. Momo cleared her throat, looked like she was going to say something, and then closed her mouth and quietly backed away before circling around behind the asphalt colossus to hide. Yes? James eventually replied. In my defense, it's really cool. Also, we just had a lot of this stuff lying around, especially the parking lot. Anesh gave his partner a long-suffering look. Oh, the best part? James quipped, seeing the expression his boyfriend was giving him. A copy of you was down here earlier helping out, so I know you think this is awesome. You can't fool me with that cute frown. Anesh sputtered a bit, trying to cover his flushed face. All right, maybe. Anyway, I came down here for a real reason. Momo, Anesh called the girl out from behind the leg of the humanoid golem they were building. Your program child wants to talk to you. Something about a confirmed intersection. Shit! Momo yelped, turning and rolling under a folding table. Is that bad? James asked in an unconcerned voice, glancing around the room. Is that worse? Worse than what? The engineer who had been trying to desperately build a document for this project while Momo and James and everyone else just plowed ahead asked. Mars, that was his name. James had a hard time forgetting that one. Worse than an unconfirmed intersection, I guess? It means it found a dungeon, Momo said, bursting up from the other side, now wearing the coat that she had thrown under there while the group was working and the poorly ventilated basement storage space had heated up. Come on, let's go! Oh, neat, James said, showing far less enthusiasm than Anesh expected from him. You don't seem excited or concerned? Anesh asked as the two of them strolled after Momo. The rest of the construction crew was either taking a break or finally catching up on documentation as they left. I would have figured you'd be all over this. I think I'm experiencing a form of burnout, James casually expressed his worst fear. Like, there's just so much magic going on all the time, I can't process everything, so my brain has stopped getting super into new things. That said, finally having a dungeon detector will be neat, assuming it works. Anesh grimaced and tried to give James a hug as they walked. Sounds a bit like innovation fatigue, he said sympathetically. It's probably especially bad for you, considering you don't really have a specialty here, huh? You're just involved in basically everything. And I want to be, James assured him. I just don't want to... I want to not want to, he sighed. I am so tired, I don't even know if that sentence made sense. And Sarah dumping naps into me every time she sees me is not helping. And yeah, it's a good day, and I feel good, and I'm just not feeling excited for more arcane problems. What an odd sentence. It is kind of great, James said sadly, which is why I feel bad for not appreciating it more. Anesh, it's magic. There was a pause while they stepped into the elevator, neither of them really comfortable having this conversation with three other people right next to them. It gave Anesh time to think, to work out what to say. Though it was hard, James's depression wasn't something that ever really went away. It was always there, waiting to take all the fun out of stuff. And the worst part was, Anesh knew that there wasn't really anything he could say to fix it. The physical symptoms of feeling disconnected from special things, constantly exhausted by a life that should be content, weren't things that you really could fix with just words. So instead, Anesh just tried to be as supportive as possible, and knew that he'd be there to be excited along with James when the feeling faded away. Well, hey, Anesh said as the elevator reached the surface and Momo hit the button to take them down to a different basement as a few people got off on the ground floor. Think of it this way. You've got skills, potions, magic items that level up, and stat point upgrades. Maybe this dungeon finally gives you actual magic spells. Then you can fill in that empty space on your character sheet. The joke was said in a subdued tone, but he said it with a smile, and he got a grin out of James in reply. I can finally use my resume that lists my occupation as sorcerer, James declared as they followed Momo out of the elevator and through the twisting halls to where she had built her AI. The girl dashed ahead of them, not bothering to hide her own nervous energy. Why haven't you been? Anesh asked him. Do you not count as a wizard yet? He smirked. James put on his best wizened old man voice. A wizard with one spell is no wizard at all, he grumbled, before switching back to his normal tone. Though, seriously, the asphalt thing is cool. I feel like we should be doing more with that blue absorb copy thing. Finding the best ones, abusing them. We're already trying to abuse the copier as much as possible, Anesh reminded him. There's a waiting list. There's a long waiting list, and it keeps growing. Yeah, we'll get there someday, James sighed wistfully as the two of them came to the door of Momo's computer lab, the metal barrier hanging open in the hallway. All right, what's up? He asked as he strolled in. Momo glanced up from where she was leaning over the desk, elbows resting on space hastily cleared among the random collection of things that had accrued here while she'd been using the room. She had been looking at one of the monitors and now stepped back to let James and Anesh see. It was a mess of numbers James didn't know the purpose of. To Anesh, it made a little more sense. He had tried something like this himself a while back, after all. Weather patterns, budget reports, missing person statistics. This just had more. So much more. Vehicle emissions and average credit card purchases, traffic patterns sourced from local camera networks. Every statistic that could be gathered, legally or not. And then, also, red totem versions of some of that same information, paired up with and compared to what showed up in mundane human records. The thing Momo had accidentally created thrived in its little ocean of data. If you asked it how it found something, it would be able to tell you eventually, but the process wasn't quite like a human. There was no, oh, I get it now, moment that set it off on a trail. It just looked for patterns, compared them, found averages, found outliers, identified strange behaviors, and found where they were focused. It was an almost worrying, terrifying tool of intelligence gathering. The only consolation to the Order members that were maybe a little concerned about its existence was that it didn't seem capable of caring about individual persons. In theory, it could know basically everything about a single human. But it wasn't really interested, or perhaps even able, to focus on that person separate from their place in the greater spreadsheet. People added to patterns. That was why it cared. And now, after weeks of number crunching, it had identified something. Somehow. Tracking 100 different things, comparing, contrasting, collating data. There was no grand reveal, and there was no precise entrance location, but both the AI and Momo seemed entirely confident in its work and the result. Alice Springs, Australia. High projected fatality rate. "This does not fill me with a sense of magic," James said as he glared at the screen. "Well then," Anesh added, "tomorrow's meeting just got a lot more complicated." James passed through the house that contained Clutter Ascent politely. Actual humans lived here now, caretakers of the dungeon's external shell, who were, in turn, kept safe by the dungeon itself. So he went through the process of knocking, removing his shoes, saying hi to the group watching TV together, and trying one of the cookies that were clearly a passionate first attempt at baking, before finally heading upstairs to visit the attic. There was probably someone here, but for the first time in a while, James wasn't here to visit Sarah. He was here to talk, mostly. To talk, to sit, to take some time and experience something magical, just for the sake of it being magic. Also to say hi to Frederick. He had brought the strange little creature a bag of cashews. James had only really encountered the thing once, but Sarah had encouraged people to drop in and say hi. Apparently, the little guy was fond of snacks, and also some kind of game that looked like chess, but absolutely was not chess. He'd been challenging people to games when they had walked through the corridors of forgotten boxes in the attic, and while he didn't extract any price for a loss, he certainly didn't have any inclination to actually explain the arcane rules either. James wandered the space under the rafters for a while, smiling as he realized that there was a part of this designated path where it felt like the ceiling was getting constantly closer, even though it never met the floor. It was like the reactor noise from Star Trek that gave the illusion of going up in pitch forever, only more claustrophobic. He wasn't looking for anything, really. He wasn't here with any goal in mind. He was just wandering, and searching around this strange, safe place. He found himself, at one point, in one of those dark, empty spaces of the mind. He tried to open a cupboard, more out of curiosity than anything else, and realized only after being transported here that it was one of the attic's treasure chests. Almost half an hour later, he put the finishing touches on the mental image key that he had put together, piece by piece building the feeling of a cold coffee shop in early June, the hiss of the espresso machine and the chatter of patrons overlapping in pleasant background noise just before the lock clicked open, and he found himself back in reality. James pocketed the little bond stick that the cupboard held, wishing that they could recreate that effect on purpose and for fun. Those mental puzzles were actually really satisfying to solve, like a combination of a coloring book and a Sudoku. Frederick never materialized, and half an hour later James found himself sitting in a far-off corner of the attic, leaning against a rolled-up comforter and staring up at the brilliant gold and purple light pouring through one of the skylights. "I feel like I'm missing something," he sighed, to no one in particular. Or, perhaps, to the dungeon in particular. Clutter Ascent was often a good listener. "I wish," James started, and then took a minute to put his runaway thought together. "I think I wish I could be like you," he admitted. "A dungeon, a space. You're only responsible for yourself, and you create all this. You just make stuff, and people come in and experience it. That really speaks to the part of me that never stops thinking about running another RPG. You know, when the free time comes back." He chuckled in the mostly still air, watching spiral fractals of dust motes dance in the sunbeams. I say that as if free time is some kind of fungible resource, and all we have to do is turn on the time faucet and I'll have more of it. Which, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that's not an option these days. Anything was possible, after all. That kind of made it a little unsurprising when the next impossible thing came up, but there were always curveballs anyway. There was an awkward moment before James figured out what was bothering him. I just realized, he partially interrupted himself, that I'm piling my personal mental health problems on you, and that's kind of not fair of me. I know Sarah said you like it when people come and talk to you, and you like to take care of everyone, but this feels like I'm asking for something you can't give me. James closed his eyes, shifted his back a little as he pushed his head into the blanket behind him. Magic is becoming normal to me, he said, his voice as neutral as he could get it. I don't know. I don't know if that's bad. I like it when life feels special, I guess. I don't want things to be normal. I know it's not normal. I get reminded every time I go to a restaurant or, James thought for a second, cracking one eye open as he did so. I guess restaurants are basically the only place I go these days. And dungeons. Still. He shrugged. I just feel like I'm back where I started, but with more money. Like, yeah, things weren't bad. I have my friends. I have people I care about. I've got a home. And now it's got a lot of very real, beautiful magic to it. And there's no other word. It's magic. He sighed again. And I feel like an asshole for feeling discontent, I guess. I'm going on a vacation in a week or so, and I'm confused as to why I don't feel some kind of thrill to go explore a mystic, hostile, eternal highway. That seems like it should be, you know, perfect. James felt tired, a bone-deep weariness that had been pulling at him all week. He had had good days, he'd had some sleep, but nothing was letting him shake the feeling of lethargy pursuing him, like he just wanted to curl up and take a 10-year-long nap. Why, he asked the warm air around him, is it not just enough to have friends, share food with them, and play some board games? James didn't really have an answer. Didn't know why he always felt like he had to do more, even as, at the same time, he felt like doing more wasn't doing anything. There was no answer, not right away, and James didn't know what else he needed to say, either to himself or to the space around him. Didn't know if putting his thoughts into words helped anyway. But, if nothing else, he found the spot that he had chosen was basically perfect for a nap. When he woke up, he felt better. Better in a way he couldn't qualify, better in a subtle, bone-deep way, like he had slept for a decade, and it might have been enough. Also, Frederick was there, halfway through chewing through the bag of cashews that had been stealthily extracted from James's pocket. The little creature didn't seem to notice James waking up, and for the first time he got a good look at it. Or a better look, anyway. It wasn't like a shadow, like he had initially thought. It had some blue scale patterns on its stomach, like a midnight salamander, and shiny black fur that ran down its limbs and back. It had a muzzle somewhere between a gecko and a raccoon, and the way it was eating was very raccoon-adjacent, too, rolling the nuts it was chowing down on over in its small hands repeatedly before nibbling them down to nothing. It had more hands than James had realized. 6 of them, in fact. Its body and legs were, in no uncertain terms, also arachnid. And suddenly James figured he realized why it kept hiding from people. You know, he spoke softly, and Frederick froze mid-cashew. We've got snakes and staplers and a half-dozen tentacle monster computer things on the roster, James said, watching the knee-high critter nervously fold his extra arms behind his small frame, hiding them out of sight. What I'm saying is, you don't need to be nervous just because you're half spider, okay? The amalgamation of ideas from living creatures stared at James with sparkling sapphire eyes. And then when James shifted to sit up, before his legs fell asleep any more than they already had, Frederick bolted into the shadows of the junk scattered around them. James sighed. So much for making friends, he started to think. But then a rustling from the pile of clear plastic tubs of Halloween decorations to his left sounded. One of them on the bottom shifted aside to make a small tunnel, out of which Frederick wiggled backward, dragging something with him. The little creation turned to regard James, still keeping 4 of his arms pinned back and concealed behind his back, but with a more comfortable consideration than panic. With a small nudge from his snout, he pushed forward a polished wooden box with a chessboard painted on top of it. James smiled and passed over the rest of the cashews. A good nap, some magic, food and board games with friends. Maybe Clutter Ascent could give him what he needed after all. Miles was having an awkward day. It had started normally. He was shadowing the woman that the old gun had made contact with a couple weeks ago, trying to figure out what she had been tasked with, or why the supposedly ancient and deadly creature was interested in her at all. He'd been tailing her for a couple weeks. Her name was Suzanne Halliston. She worked with a company called Dow Chemicals in Bayton, Texas, and she owned 2 dogs. Well, her husband owned 2 dogs. She didn't like dogs, as near as Miles could tell, and ever since he'd gotten a moment alone with her cell phone and had turned it into an always-on Audiobook, he'd had a first-hand look at just how bitter a person in their late 40s could be. Suzanne Halliston did not like dogs, the weather, other drivers, her husband, her eldest and only daughter, the employees at any given drive-thru, her job, or, it would seem, herself. Miles didn't really like her either, after a week of listening to her constant whining when she thought no one was listening. She was also a workaholic and spent most of her time on site at the chemical plant that she did safety oversight for. So he also knew that she didn't like the look of the series of structures. She didn't like the walking. She didn't like her coworkers. It was exhausting. Miles had a map of the property and had already compared it to reality just to make sure. It was mostly, as far as he could tell, pipes. Pipes and tanks. He didn't know much about chemical refinement, so maybe this number of pipes was normal. The thing making today awkward was twofold. The first thing was that he had to get a backup car on short notice. Another rogue, a girl named Lynn that he had never met, but had known the passphrases that Miles had been given, had teleported into his hotel and commandeered his rental car for something. She hadn't said what, and Miles got the impression he was actually still being simultaneously tested and trained by Nate and JP. So he had wasted an hour today getting another car and getting back to his stakeout. The second thing was that he'd noticed something. Specifically, he'd noticed, a little too late as someone was getting out of the vehicle, that the van parked street side behind him was the exact same one that had been there the last 3 days, and so was the red sedan in front of him. And while part of his brain was trying to rationalize why someone would repeatedly park on a stretch of road with nothing of value nearby except line of sight to a chemical plant, the rest of his brain was focused on the man approaching and drawing a handgun from a sharp black holster under his coat. Miles was a lot of things. Miles was sneaky, smart, and some other third S word that generally meant a good choice for espionage. Miles was also, in his own opinion, pretty damn cute. But despite all of the spycraft training Miles had jammed into his head over the last 2 months, he was not a trained fighter. He was not a combatant. So he froze as the man approached his car in a slight crouch, handgun held in a 2-handed grip as his eyes swept the area. There were no other cars around on the road. There was no one to save him. Miles realized he had only seconds to act, forgot entirely that he owned a telepad, and reached for the keys, still in the ignition. The man passed his car by, and approached the sedan about 20 feet past his front bumper, raising his gun and yelling suddenly at the person still in the driver's seat there to get out of the vehicle, even as that car's engine rumbled to life. The woman in that car absolutely did not get out. Instead, she floored it. The man on the road started firing, pops of gunfire sounding loud even through the windshield. The smell of gunpowder suddenly added to the hot Texas air that was coming through his air conditioning. Miles could hear the man on the street swearing, even though he could no longer see him. He'd chosen the stealth option and sunk down in his seat to the point that he shouldn't be visible from the road. To his right, he heard the van's tires squeal as it pulled out into the street, and he yelled, "Get in!" and a door slamming, followed by more engine roaring. It was suddenly quiet again. Miles peeked over the dashboard. The street was empty. He reached for his phone and then grumbled as he realized it was in a different cup holder than what he was used to. Then his brain made the connection. Same cars, 3 days in a row, but he was in a different car because Lynn had taken his. Holy shit, he'd gotten lucky. So, at least 2 other people, or groups, were here, in this place where the literal only thing to do was run a stakeout on this one specific chemical processing facility. That was cool. His heart was still pounding, and so he was alert and on edge when Susan happened to arrive at work. He was paying attention when he realized that she'd been unusually silent today. When he noticed that she brought with her a hard-shell black case that could only ever hold a pistol of some kind. The security at the gate didn't react, so either this was normal or something was up. Miles listened intently to his stolen audio feed. There was some background noise, so the bug was working. Susan just wasn't saying anything today. A massive shift from the woman that hadn't shut up about everything she'd hated for the last 12 days. By this point, he had her routines and the associated sound effects down to the point that he knew what it sounded like when she walked into her office. Knew what it sounded like for her to flick the lights on, push her chair into position, and sit down. She didn't sit down today. Instead, there was a heavy thump of plastic on wood, 2 snaps of clasps being unlatched, and a long, heavy sigh. It was the kind of resigned noise that Miles was familiar with from fiction, but had never actually heard a human make. And then the first thing she'd spoken all day. "Friday. Today's it, huh?" It sounded dead, no emotion. In a mechanical, almost rehearsed tone, Susan added, "I hate my life and want it to end." Miles tensed up, every part of him suddenly horrified that he was about to bear witness to a random woman's suicide. But instead of a gunshot, there was a sound of a door handle rattling. Then his phone exploded. Not in the metaphorical sense, where a slew of texts came in all at once. No, Miles's phone detonated. Not all at once, either. He could see the shockwave that rippled through it, almost in slow motion, propagating from the direction of the chemical plant and blasting the device to shrapnel in a cone that accelerated in an unpredictable rapid jerk forward that left him screaming in shocked pain as part of what used to be his touchscreen carved through his cheek. Other chunks of debris fired so fast they embedded themselves in the driver's side window and pylon. The sound of the impacts mixed with the electric hiss of a battery discharging as it was rent apart. Everything suddenly went quiet, except for Miles swearing. He didn't even have his first aid kit in this car. It was in the other rental, and who knew how far away that was. A quick check showed the chemical refinery was still standing. Whatever had blown up his phone hadn't hit the building, or his car, which was good. Probably. He held a pile of McDonald's napkins against the bleeding hole in his face as he drove back rapidly to the hotel with shaking hands. No phone, and something insane happening, meant one thing. Time to make use of his telepad back and fill in Nate on how his life was about to get way more complicated. The Akashic Sewer was about as disgusting as ever. There was clearly a pattern to when, why it opened, or at least there was that weird fuzzy logic in the back of James's head that screamed that there was some unknown criteria at play here. Anesh thought there was a much more overt logic, but he hadn't actually found anything linking it all together yet. So for now, they just had Lua keeping an eye out, and they sent in a team every time the door was there and accessible. It came out to about once or twice a week, and the door tended to vanish when unobserved after a delve was finished. They were here on kind of late notice, with James already packed for his planned vacation after the short meeting with the rest of the Pillars of the Order tomorrow. But he'd largely given up on sleeping anyway, and so he had little trouble joining an Anesh with some free time and a messed up sleep schedule, and an overly excited Ethan who was not being shy about letting James know how cool it was to be teamed up together again. Putting aside that one main distraction, The process was getting more clear. The sewer was gross, awful, and in many cases probably literally toxic. They all wore thick filter masks, but James had asked Nate to find them some actual military-grade gas masks for the future. Nate had muttered something about not putting up with ordering from anything except Cisco, and delegated it, but James was sure that it would still get done at some point. The wildlife hadn't improved here either. The screaming balls of rat skulls woven together with sinew and dripping wet rope were still around, flinging themselves down hallways with no real regard for hunting. Just miniature bone hydras, here to cause violence and very little else. Though James was willing to acknowledge, especially with how Ethan froze up after the first one, that they were probably a great way to sweep away inexperienced students that got trapped here. Those arm vines were more prevalent too. They were growing around pipes in the walls like they were giving them a long hug, only with more bulging pus sacs than any hug should ever include. The team had plenty of time to examine the wildlife as they moved, as they were not making good time. Because the biggest change was that the dungeon had warped itself to have more than just straight corridors with the occasional intersection. Dark, pipe-filled hallways led to miniature mazes, the walls and floors shifting abruptly to decayed wood and a layer of mud. There was, so far, nothing living here they hadn't seen yet, but the hallways suddenly twisted in sharp corners and slight inclines and drops. The two mazes they'd been through so far were simple enough a toddler could have passed them if they were drawn on paper, but the fact that they were seeing something new grow like this was worrying. The little mazes also had a couple of those overly hostile academic questions scrawled on the walls. The group answered them, after explaining to Ethan that they tried to funnel the sparks to a single person so they would have the most flexibility with the chests at the end. The second maze had another weird feature, too. A small alcove jutting away from one of the side corridors, within which there was a bright blue ring of moss on the floor that glowed like it was radioactive, and a rotting wooden lectern in the middle of it. Anesh confirmed the moss wasn't actually radioactive with the Geiger counter that he'd brought along. There was a handprint on the lectern, though, like they were invited to step forward and touch it. They did not step forward and touch it. They passed a dozen or so rooms, declining to enter any of the ones that were locked with red sparks. They hadn't been fighting enough to be comfortable spending points that they might need to get out later. One room wasn't actually locked at all, but it did contain hundreds of the little wet rat things that normally lurked up in the pipes and drank the dripping blue slime. They were stacked in there, floor to ceiling, and when the door opened, the entire collective began screaming, clawing at each other to breach out and rip and tear at the intruders, or just spill into the halls and flee down the pipes. Ethan had been almost swept away by the matted fur tide before James and Anesh got the door slammed shut. The little monsters were blinded by the powerful lights they all had strapped to their armor, but that didn't stop them from shoving forward anyway. The two of them had to hold the door there, leaving Ethan the disgusting task of splattering the shambling critters that had poured out before they could compose themselves, and then getting him to help them wedge a piece of broken pipe under the handle to seal the door shut before they could let go. They stopped checking doors after that. There was also a weird moment when Anesh's Geiger counter actually did go off. It wasn't exactly surprising. James had always figured that they should be coming down here in hazmat suits. What was surprising was that the actual range of the radiation seemed to drop off exponentially. It came from one of those gurgling columns of thick fluid that poured out of a breached pipe and down into the floor. It was very radioactive, but only if you were within half an inch of it. If you were an inch away, it was a little radioactive. If you were beyond that, it was... Well, safe was a word that got thrown around a lot, and it probably didn't apply here. But it wasn't going to cause telomere decay, that was for sure. It would cause nausea, though. Even through the mask, James could smell this one, and it smelled like the worst lemon. Overpowering and rotten. Anesh had wanted to take a sample, even if just to hand it off to a physicist somewhere to confuse them. But they hadn't brought any way to carry it, except for a jar in the duffel bag that had shattered during the whole wave of rats thing. So they made a note for the future and figured that they'd see it again later. An hour and a half of exploration passed, and it did feel like exploration a bit more now, instead of just walking in a straight line, before the trio came to the end of a long bend in the hallway. About 50 feet ahead of them was the mouth of the tunnel. James and Ethan flicked off their flashlights while Anesh, watching their backs, waited a bit more distance before joining them. "Check your armor," James instructed Ethan as he and Anesh gave their own black-shelled forms a once-over. They were waiting about 20 feet away from the angry orange light that poured in through the breach in the pipes. "Why?" Ethan asked, voice muffled by the mask. "I'd know if I'd been stabbed." "Because it's a good habit," James said. And he didn't really need to say any more. The kid was already moving to copy him without having to be told twice. But this was a sewer, and screwing around here was a bad idea. "There's these maggot things that can burrow into you, and you don't feel it," James told him. "Also, if there's any rapid mushroom growths, that's a problem we need to burn off. Now turn around so I can check your back." Ethan did not complain after that. He just doubled his efforts with wide eyes. After they had cleaned themselves and made sure that their weapons, such as they were intact, they moved forward. James and Ethan were carrying quarterstaves, which were, as far as the door into this place were concerned, brooms. Anesh had brought the binder from the office that turned impacts into paper, and then also a long ruler that was vector-locked once it was moving at a certain speed. "So, are we going to meet your friend?" Ethan asked. "I promise you she is not my friend," James replied, shaking his head at the excitement the younger man displayed. "Yet," Anesh added in a wry voice. James looked over at him, narrowing his eyes as if to say, "Yeah, but really?" Anesh didn't respond except to tilt his head and cock his own eyebrows with a shrug that communicated, "I mean, yeah? Who do you think you are, Mr. I'm friends with a stapler?" "Okay," Ethan said out loud, breaking the silent spell. "So, I don't really remember what these things are like, and I kind of forgot to read the manual before coming in here." James sighed. "Rat roaches are basically humanoid. They're almost always hostile, they smell awful. Their weak points are organs because they aren't very well put together. Literally, you can sometimes see vital points through their skin. Aim for those. Or go for disarms. The pseudo shoulder joint on their extra arms is very brittle. You can just snap it off with a good kick. Don't let them cut you with their knives. They are almost always infected with something." He glanced over at Ethan, the kid looking a bit sick. "That's, I know," James said. Or, well, I shouldn't assume I know what you're going to say, but if it's "that's either brutal or disgusting," then yes, I know. "Yeah, man, what the fuck? And they're going to try to kill us?" Ethan asked, like he hadn't just been going through a dungeon that was already doing its level best to put him in the ground. "Is that a surprise?" Anesh muttered. "But if they look like people—" James snorted and restrained himself, barely, from slapping the back of Ethan's head. "The Camercondas didn't look like people, but they are. The rat roaches look people adjacent, but they aren't. Except for maybe one or two. I don't really know. We'll see." He rolled his shoulder and stepped forward toward the end of the tunnel. "Ready?" "Ready?" "Sure." The replies came back to him. The light was from a source this time, instead of just being omnipresent. Another change to the dungeon. A massive burning orb hung above the black gravel rectangle that dominated the center of the arena. Flickering shadows rolled around the walls and ground, cast by the wire fence, the red stone pillars, and the pack of rat roaches standing in the space. As always, there was a crowd. 50, maybe 60 of the creatures. They were packed close together, many of them pressed against the wire fence around the court in a way that made their fur and skin bulge outward. They did not speak. They did not utter any sounds. They made a rattling noise anyway, though, slamming weapons and claws against the fence, the floor, and each other to create the entrance music for the trio. Many of them still wore scraps of human clothing, taken, James knew, from those who had died here before. Standing at mid-court, there were 3 rat roaches. 2 looked about as ravenous as the rest of the crowd. slavering blue drool dripping from the corners of their misaligned jaws. But they stood behind and deferred to the one at the point of their vanguard. "So I've been wondering," James called across the court, their team stopping before setting foot on the gravel. "Did you just hang out here all day, waiting for someone to drop in? Because I can get you a Switch if you want. You can jam some Animal Crossing instead of just lurking. Eh? What do you think?" She did not look how James remembered exactly. Again. None of the three rat roaches on the court did, but the middle one had changed the most of all. Pale cream fur, marked with patches of ridged chitin and exposed skin, as well as pockets of red-capped mushrooms growing out of her flesh. A head with a rat's muzzle sloping backward into a more rounded skull, with a single uneven antenna coming out of one side. She had 4 eyes, 2 very small insectile ones up front and 2 larger mammalian ones farther up her face. Uneven with each other, of course, but more symmetrical now than before. 2 arms jutted out of her right side, a third from her left, and digitigrade legs that ended in clawed feet that had already dripped blood onto the gravel from where they had been torn up. A mismatched creature, a failure of design, and yet she was taller than before. No, not exactly taller. Her back was straighter, her extra arm more independent, supporting her grip on her spear instead of just flailing with it. The patterns of chitin and fur were less raw and angrily infected where they met skin and hide. Her eyes were focused on him. All of them. When she spoke, this time, it wasn't as mangled either. "You are back," she gurgled, the crowd silent, still flawed, but far more intelligible. "More taunts? Afraid to fight?" "James." Anesh nudged him quietly and tilted his head at the rat roach behind the leader. James glanced at it and realized it too had been modified. It was more sleek, like a sprinter. The other one had more muscle attached, but neither of them came close to how much she'd changed. They still looked like broken prototypes. "Love what you've done with yourself," James said. "New skincare routine? Divine intervention, maybe?" he prompted. The rat roach shook her head in a gesture that was a blatant misunderstanding of human body language, small droplets of blue spittle sizzling on the ground as she did. "I remake myself," she called out, "to offer our God a better prayer, over and over again, until victory or death. Now come, or we will get hungry." The rat roach waved her spear at the crowd around them. James shrugged and stepped forward. "Your god seems like a dick," he said. A split second later he slapped aside the spear aimed at his chest. Beside him, Ethan and Anesh engaged the other two, swapping once they realized they had different strengths and weaknesses. But James stuck to his dance partner. It was almost disappointing, but she hadn't really changed that much, and he still wildly outclassed her as a fighter. So he got a little cocky and started throwing taunts as he ducked her stabs. "So hey," he asked, keeping his breathing steady, "does it count as a prayer if you keep losing?" He kicked her leg out and backed off as she spun her claws out to recover, hissing in response. "I mean, if I were some kind of weird decay and violence god, I'd be kind of mad if my follower kept losing." She screamed, and James took the chance to catch her spear, yank it out of her weaker paws, and fling it sideways to trip up the rat roach that Ethan was sort of struggling with. "You're going to have to talk to me eventually," he told his opponent as she tried to vomit into his eyes again. "Come on, we literally do not have to do this," he said as she tried to tear his throat out. And then with a sigh, because it wasn't working, he snapped a kick into her midsection so hard she coughed up blue blood and bile. "I know you're smarter than this," he whispered to her as she lay on the ground. "Your god didn't even build you to last. Come on, just come with me. Your friends can come too. We can find a way to help you." His taunting was gone now, just replaced by a sad and almost desperate resignation. "Please?" James asked. "Ah," the rat roach panted. "And trade one slaver god for another?" she muttered. a horrifying toothy grin on her maw as she held herself up off the ground, vomit and blood dripping onto the black gravel. Lose my value? James knelt in front of her. Finally, she was at least talking. I can't promise you anything in a way that would be believable, I guess. You just have to trust me that I can help you. He held out a hand to the girl who was bleeding on the ground in front of him, staring up with confused and pained eyes. The rat roach reached out, took his hand, and then screamed a laugh as she yanked him forward and drove a knife into his chest. James windmilled his arms as she tackled him backward, losing a grip on the blade now stuck in his chest, but slamming him into the ground regardless. Weak! She screamed at him. Kind and weak! She raised a hand, pulling another buried knife out of the gravel, and grinned down at him. Then Ethan hit her in the side of the head with his quarterstaff, swinging it around like he was going for a grand slam. Something cracked, something snapped, and James was pretty sure that the solid wooden stick wasn't the thing that had just lost the most durability. The rat roach toppled off of him, skidding sideways and rolling up in a screaming ball of fur and beetle shell pressed against the fallen form of one of her teammates. A pair of feet came into James's vision as Nesh took up a guard position between him and the still-moving rat roach. Holy shit, are you okay? Ethan asked in a panicked voice. Yeah, you good? Anesh echoed, much calmer but still worried. James stood, taking a deep breath. His chest hurt, but... He grabbed the dagger, the hilt wrapped in what was probably just rat roach hide from an unlucky casualty of this place. With a quick jerk, he pulled it out. The pain stopped almost right away, as did the bleeding. The rat roach was still letting out pained laughs. Got you, you die, a good prayer, got you, she was muttering over and over. Ow, James said, loudly and clearly. Then he tossed the knife onto the ground in front of her, cutting off her muttering as she saw him stand up, eyes widening in disbelief. So, yeah, James addressed Ethan, I'm going to go with not friends. Also, holy shit, our armor is really good for this kind of thing, and a single point of endurance does a lot. Anesh, check this out. Stab me. No! Anesh gave him an incredulous, wide-eyed stare over his shoulder, looking around the room as his concern over James being stabbed faded. Can we leave now? Please? Yeah, get the door. You've got more sparks than me. The rat roaches around them had gone silent now, even if they were still staring at the victors on the field, which was perfect because James had more to say. I'm going on vacation, he announced to the room, and mostly the one who had stabbed him. And then, in a quieter voice, just to her, he added, I'm going to say it again because I think you need to hear it. I don't hate you. My offer is real, and kindness is not weakness. He stood over her prone form, keeping a slightly more cautious distance this time. But here's the bitter part. It won't last forever. I am offering you a way out. I am offering you a hand up, but I am not responsible for you, and if you keep knifing people, someday you're going to get added to a long list of monsters that haven't survived contact with me. Yo, I got books, let's go, Ethan called from the exit door. They're still all looking at me, and I want to leave. James waved him off, asking for just another few minutes. Then he sighed. I see you, he said to the unresponsive rat roach. And I see a lot of who I used to be in you. And I want to help you because I know how much it sucks to be angry and full of hate all the time. Maybe you don't agree, but I don't know. Remake yourself again and again, as many times as you need to. But remember that you're always on your own until you get help. James, Anesh yelled, holding the rusted portcullis open to the security door that led back to the high school. Come on, I'm not going to stand here all day. I'm coming, James answered back, and then, to his not friend, he said a goodbye. I'll see you when I'm back from vacation. I'll bring you some pictures of mountains. You'll hate it. What was originally supposed to be a short meeting between James Nanesh and the other main figures of the Order had rapidly spiraled out of control. Everyone was here, because everything was suddenly a lot more urgent than expected. There was more to do than anyone had expected, either. Maybe, James had started, and Karen, of all people, had cut him off. "You are going on vacation," she said. "You haven't taken a day off in—" Karen trailed off and didn't finish the sentence. "And also, I suspect you're not sleeping. You need time off to prevent burnout. Everyone else eventually will too, but you, right now." There was a group of people here that James didn't recognize. Mostly young, athletic-looking men and women keeping to themselves off to the side of the room. A number of different yellow orb skills flared when he looked at them, nudging his brain to notice how they watched things, how they were armed. When JP swept by and handed them all packets of paper, James realized what he was looking at. Rogues. He'd go say hi in a bit. JP could hire who he wanted, but James would be damned if he didn't immerse them into the Order's culture. The discussion started, and the planning had gotten so long-winded that Nate had found the time to sneak away and prepare a buffet dinner. 3 dungeons, or at least 3 points of interest. One was a sort of known factor. James and Anesh would be tackling that under the guise of a road trip and a vacation, or maybe the other way around. The other 2 were going to require investigation and exploration in new and potentially deadly spaces. The teams had come together in the end, but there was a fierce competition to actually be part of them, especially from the newer members. In the end, it was decided to send 2 people to each region the old-fashioned way, secure a hotel or another space to use, and then telepad in the rest. 14-person teams for each dungeon, each one containing experienced combatants, members of research, at least 1 rogue, 2 or 3 new members of the Order to avoid monopolization of power, and also, just to get people who were the most excited, some field experience. They would not be holding back on equipment either. They would not be sparing any cost. Money was less important than a safe first delve. Even the office, after all, had things like the camera condas. Things that were functionally auto-kills on any delver that didn't get lucky enough or wasn't prepared for it. And if you didn't know what to prepare for, you couldn't be prepared for it. So they needed to rely on being over-geared, over-prepared, ready for anything that a dungeon might have for them. Also, while this was going on, the FBI had requested the Order's help on another missing persons case. This time not a missing employee, but a cold case that they decided to use the Order's expertise to work through the backlog of. JP and Decay were on that, bringing with them another pair of the agents in training. Which would have left a small power vacuum at the lair, if that was the way they operated, but it really wasn't. Harvey would continue running the response program, and while he wasn't happy with James choosing a slower than desired speed, he had been given the green light to reach out to local advocates for police reform and make contact. The response crews would be under strength with so many people out, so local dungeon activity was being dialed down until they could recruit enough to resume normal operations. Sarah and the group she was working with for the Clutter Ascent would remain active as normal, which was at this point the main group seen to the mental health needs of the Order. Karen wasn't going, having fully transitioned into being a combination dispute resolution machine and budgetary master, so there'd be someone on hand to solve most problems of that nature at least. As it stood, it was strange, but since their main activity was simply delving known dungeons, it didn't disrupt the whole Order that much to transition to exploring potential new dungeons. Even if their supposed leader was on vacation, it made James feel both comforted and mildly put out. But only mildly. While everyone was around, people took the opportunity to discuss different magics that were running rampant. Reed handed out new shield bracers to everyone who'd be heading out who didn't already have one of the more developed status quo versions. People talked about yellow or blue orbs they'd found, sometimes that they'd wished they'd been able to copy, sometimes they were glad they hadn't. Someone had gotten 2 ranks of glaive from a yellow, and one of the new girls, Chavoy, had practically jumped at the chance to fabricate something in the basement that would trigger the skill. One rank in a weird weapon skill still almost always made it worth it to use that over something a person had only been training with for a month or two. Some people had triggered their bonds, gained from Clutter Ascent sticks. It wasn't just James and Anesh. The templating had changed on all of them. James and Anesh took the time to test their sharing of speed, too, and found it thankfully wouldn't kill them if they used it in a car. It was their speed, not the car's speed, and it was kind of a silly definition of the word, too. They could dial it up or down, how much they were pouring into the other person, and basically just make their partner faster. Or slower. You could take instead of give, without asking. The bonds were a massive trust exercise, especially since no one knew if you could ever break them. The other people who'd gotten bonds could share vision and rhetoric, and both of those were fun to see in action. Also, the Order's little improvised theater group had made their first collective level up. They all had a vague impression of having to choose together and needing to reach a consensus about their choice before it stuck, which might be a problem going forward for larger groups. They were all now 1 point higher up on motivation, and it showed. Dramatically. Pun mostly not intended. And everyone, practically everyone, who had any kind of even remotely physical role had been abusing the exercise potions like they were water in the desert. Push yourself to the point of near breaking. Down one of those, feel your muscles rebuild themselves stronger and harder, and then do it again. With a properly designed regimen and a diet that would keep you alive, someone who had spent most of their life out of the gym could cram 2 years' worth of strength training into about a week. So it was that the Order mobilized. With spirited debate over who should go where, over what to do about the AI in the basement, over whether or not Dave should keep flying Pendragon without filing flight plans with the FAA. But ultimately, with excitement and eagerness to see just how weird the world really was. It was finally infectious to James. There was, as one of the interns put it, a lot of misinformation about how normal everything is, and everyone here had seen enough to know that normal was just a disguise. There was more behind the curtain. And yes, not everyone was going out to peak. Some of them were staying here, content to continue forming a private peacekeeping force or learning how to duplicate buildings. Those poor souls, so stuck in their boring, gray routines. But just being around, being close to where the secrets were being collected like coins in a dragon's hoard, it was electrifying. Like the rooms behind hidden doors truly were endless. Almost made James regret he was going on vacation in the middle of it, until he remembered where he was headed in the first place.